What would you do if your wife was 8 months pregnant and had a gun pointed at her stomach, and you couldn't think of any way to help her at that moment? That's what's happening to people. It's still happening. What would you do if your daughter was killed for trying to go to school? What would you do if you were killed just because you had a business that your government didn't like, and they killed you and left your wife and your children with nothing to survive? I've had family who've been kidnapped already. I've had family who've been killed. My father was killed. My mother and myself, we were left with nothing when my father was killed. My wife was pregnant and had a gun pointed at her stomach. What would you do in that situation? What could you do?
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Good intro.
All right. Yeah, my name is Shabir. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I was born in Kabul, and I moved to the United States in 2000 as a young child with my mother, my infant sister, as well as my grandmother and aunt on my father's side. And we've lived in Salt Lake City since then.
So you've bounced back and forth between the two.
Well, we lived here permanently, and then we'd go back to Afghanistan to visit family members. You can't ever forget family, and we had so much family back home. And my mother would work, as a single mother, she would work 3 jobs just to be able to help support family back home and try and help as much as we could. And we would go back every year when we could, or every other year, and we'd go visit for a month or 2 months at a time.
How do you remember Afghanistan growing up there?
I remember some bits from when I was younger, and then I also have more recent memories, from the times I visited and lived there when I was older, and it's changed a lot, and so it's difficult to really remember in just one light or another. When I remember it in the terms of just being around family and being in our homes and visiting and having family and friends, those are all the happy memories. That's when you think it's the best place on earth, because you have everything you need. You have your loved ones around you, and you don't think about everything else that's going on everywhere else. But then at the same time, I can think back and remember my mother trying to keep me in the house, not letting me go outside, even though she, as a single woman, she would go out and do whatever she needed. She would go out to the store. She wouldn't want me to go out with her, simply because she didn't feel as if it was safe for me as a child. So just kind of looking back on that, even then I understood the risks of going out, the fears she had, especially with our familial background, and her fear of myself or my sister either getting kidnapped or getting into trouble, where she just wanted to protect us. But then, I also have the memories of our engagement and getting married and living there for a short little while and just having family and friends around us, and that it's a very different perspective.
So you were talking about your mom. Can you tell us a little bit about your dad?
Yeah, my father was a tailor, and he was also a journalist. He actually died pretty young. He was only 25 years old when he passed away. And when I say passed away, it wasn't really in a calm sense. He was actually killed in front of my mother and I. It's actually my very first memory, was him being shot, my mother holding him, and him passing away in her arms. It was difficult for everyone in our house. He was a journalist, and he was writing about women's rights. That painted a pretty big target on his back. And because of that, we traveled and we moved from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and things sort of caught up with us. My mother was 8 months pregnant when that happened. We were in Peshawar, Pakistan, and we woke up in the middle of the night. My father caught the guys who had broken into our house looking for him. He grabbed them, and they pulled the gun out and shot him through the chest, and killed him in front of us. And they got away with it. They were coming after him because of his views, because of what he had to say about women's rights, and he chose that it was more important to be able to say what mattered than it was to protect himself, and that showed.
I'm sorry for that. So, fast forward a little bit. You met your beautiful wife.
That was it's a little bit of a longer story. As I mentioned, when I was a child, we'd go back to Afghanistan to visit. And it was funny because as we were kids and we were growing up, her family had also moved to Pakistan. And so they knew our family, and we were right there together. And eventually our family when Pakistan ended up being more dangerous too, after the U.S. had gone in, most of her family had gone back to Afghanistan, and hers had as well. So when I would go back to visit, they also lived there. They were also our neighbors in both countries. And as a child, it was kind of funny because her sister would tease her and ask her, who are you going to marry? Who are you going to end up with? And it was funny because she had actually said when she was, I think, 6 years old, that someday she was going to end up marrying me. And, this was in a joking sort of environment just with her sister, and her sister was teasing her about it. And then eventually it ended up coming true after, spending a little bit more time together, getting to know each other, and getting engaged much later on.
So you guys ended up getting engaged, and then you ended up getting married?
So we originally got engaged at the we had gone to Afghanistan because my sister had her engagement, and we ended up getting engaged at just a few weeks later, having our engagement party at least, and then we came back to the States, and after a little while I went back, and my family had deemed that it still was not really the safest of climates for me in particular in Afghanistan. So, we decided it might be better to get married elsewhere. And especially with an Afghan passport, you can't really go many places. So we actually ended up getting married in Mecca. We performed our nikah, or the marriage ceremony, in the Haram, the Haram Sharif, which is in front of the Kaaba. And we figured it's a pretty unique place to get married. And that year there were 7.7 million visitors. It was right after Ramadan. Actually during Ramadan. It was on the 23rd night. And so it was a pretty amazing place for us to be able to get married. And, I was fortunate enough to have myself, my mother, and my uncle there. And on her side, she had her brother come in from the UK. Her other brother that was living with her in Afghanistan was with her mother and her father. And so we really got to have a really nice trip and make the most of it. And there's both beauty in it and the horror on the other side of the reason why we were there to get married is because it wasn't necessarily safe for us in Afghanistan.
You say it wasn't safe, leading up to the fall, it was getting more unsafe, yeah?
Yeah. It was getting more and more unsafe, getting to the fall of Afghanistan, and specifically for us, because her father worked with the U.S. military for 8 years, and her family was not very happy. Not her direct family, but over there, when I say family, I mean more like in essence, you have sort of like a cultural family of a larger group. It's, they have different almost tribes there, and there were people that are not too happy about her marrying someone who lives in the States. And that kind of goes along the lines of the Taliban too. They're not happy about women in Afghanistan going overseas. It was strange to me at first, because I'm an Afghan. I'm from there. I was born there. It's strange to me, but even then, it's a weird sense of twisted sense of patriotism, of not wanting the women in their culture to go elsewhere, but it doesn't make sense. And I feel like it kind of is derived from that, a little bit of a twisted ideology of thinking that, thinking that women aren't necessarily similar to men, or they're not full humans, kind of thinking that they're almost a possession. in some senses. And that's kind of the same thing that led to the Taliban not allowing the women to go to school, restricting women, and just sort of holding a tight grip around women in society. And it really showed in our relationship and people being unhappy. And, you know, it wasn't anyone in her immediate family. Everyone was happy. It's, you know, so-and-so's seventh cousin from somewhere else is getting upset and saying, hey, how come this guy's allowing this guy to marry his daughter? And that sentiment sort of grows. And then you get people who are upset about it. And then they were already upset with her family because her father had worked with the U.S. military. Even the people they lived around, people in their own neighborhood, weren't too happy about that. So they would kind of hide that fact as far as they could and not really tell people that he had worked with the military, simply just to kind of stay away from that. And it, you know, hoping all in one day that the U.S. would sort of reciprocate and be able to help them and get them out when they needed it. And that kind of fell down the line. But yeah.
So at one point, you decided to come back to the U.S. and you were separated from Nabila.
So this was a little bit further along. When COVID hit, I actually was able to work remotely, and it was still pretty unsafe for me to be in Afghanistan. So I was able to secure a visa for her to Dubai, and I ended up finding a cheaper hotel apartment that we could get there, and we lived in Dubai for a little over 6 months. And we were able to be together, and we were waiting because with COVID, the embassy was completely shut down. They weren't doing any interviews. So we didn't really see a chance for her to get her visa and for her to come over. But, you know, with her at that point already being my wife, I didn't want to keep waiting. So I went over there and worked remotely during the nights, and we got to spend time there. And eventually it got to be pretty pricey, and we decided, hey, you know, with everything going on, it's risky, but we'll take the risk. And we ended up going back to Afghanistan. And we did that because we found out she was pregnant. With the pregnancy, you know, we figured having family around would be very helpful. And we couldn't really be just alone with just the two of us and her being, you know, pregnant, especially with medical costs that we might be looking at and everything else. And so we went back to Afghanistan, and I went with her. And I stayed there with her for close to about 4 months, as long as I could, really, until I had to come back to the States. And when I came back, that's about, I want to say 2 months before everything started to really fall apart. I came back in June, and, you know, by August 14th, everything had fallen apart. And, you know, that, in my eyes, was kind of the worst part of it all. Because I was thinking the whole time that, you know, we'd find a way for her to get out. The embassy had, when I had just come back, about a month prior to that, 2 months prior, the embassy had just started to reopen. They originally started by doing 6 interviews a day, which is very slow considering that there's millions waiting for interviews. But we figured, hey, maybe this will get pushed along. And we decided that, you know, if need be, I was going to go back. But at that time, it was a little bit risky. And I had to come back stateside. And the moment that everything kind of went bad, I took off and tried to go get her. And that's how I ended up being stuck in India for a little over a month. The flight before mine was the first one to get canceled, going from New Delhi to Kabul. And my flight was not necessarily completely canceled, but it was rebooked every day for a week straight until they finally announced that, hey, there's not going to be any flights. And I was just in India spending, you know, 20, 22, 23 hours a day on the phone, racking up thousands of dollars in phone bills, calling anyone and everyone, trying to do whatever I could to try and get her out.
What's going through your mind at that time, like putting yourself back into those shoes?
I couldn't help but think, that it was almost like history repeating itself. When my father passed away, or when he was killed, my mother was 8 months pregnant. And, obviously her biggest fear was losing the child. Even though her husband's dying in her arms, her biggest fear was, I've got this 8-month, infant that I'm trying to not allow to die. And so she protected my baby sister, and we ended up going back to Afghanistan, and she gave birth, and that worked for us. But now my wife is 8 months pregnant, and she's stuck. And all that could go through my mind was, no matter what, I had to get her out so that she could have her son, so that we could live our life. I couldn't foresee a future with her staying there. I just couldn't see any way where anything would ever happen in our life if she wasn't able to get out.
So what happened next?
I went to India, and during that entire time, the only thought that came into my mind was the same day I took off, they had tried to get into the airport, and only people with a U.S. passport or green card were getting let through. And the only idea that came to my mind was, okay, well, I have a U.S. passport, so I'll do whatever I have to get there, and I'll get my wife out. That's the only thing that I could think of. So I tried everything I could to get there. And then while in India, I was speaking to people at CENTCOM, I was speaking to people in the Air Force, I was speaking to people in the senator's office, anyone and everyone that would listen, I spoke to. And I reached out to everyone I knew, and I had some friends that reached back out to me and said, hey, here's someone that might be able to help. And they connected me to, a friend of mine connected me with her father, who runs the Conservative Daily podcast. And I went on air with them and just trying to get help. And they were trying to help me out too and trying to get things going. And that night I was leaving India, and that night I had already gone from India to Dubai. I was in Dubai for a couple of weeks, and I had booked another flight. I had a contact in Dubai who's going to get me to Pakistan because I didn't have a Pakistan visa. And I was going to just go across the border from Pakistan to go into Afghanistan to help get her out. And while we were on air, they found my name on some lists, and they really redirected me and told me that it would not be a good idea at that time for me to go through with the plan, as the border would have been really dangerous for me specifically at the time. And that kind of canceled things. So I got on the next flight. Rather than going to Pakistan, I went back to Washington, D.C. And this entire time, I still only had one pair of basketball shorts, 2 T-shirts, and one pair of ethnic clothes. And I had a rucksack with me that weighed about 80, 90 pounds. And all I had was just supplies, because my only plan was get there, get to her, survive as long as we need to on the street by the airport, and get into the airport. And so I'm in DC with nothing but, pair of shoes, 2 pairs of socks, 2 shirts, and a pair of shorts. And I was trying to find every organization I could out there. And I was reaching out to anyone and everyone to try and find a way to help get my wife out. I kind of searched high and low to try and make anything happen. I went to the stations where they were bringing the refugees in, volunteered my time there to try and help as best as I could. I figured that karma, whether or not it's real, I figured I'll put some good out there and hopefully some good comes back to me. And I tried to volunteer my time and help in the immigration centers where they're bringing all the refugees. I ended up going to the Marriott Hotel, waiting out behind the Marriott for 2-3 days, and finally was able to meet with, ended up speaking with Task Force Pineapple and a bunch of other people, and I was trying to make any and every plan I could, trying to find ways to help my family. And it was rough. And while I'm in the hotel room, I get a phone call. And this gentleman calls me and introduces himself, tells me his name is, starts speaking to me, and asks me to tell him my story and tell him what's going on with my family. And then he tells me that, he's with this organization called the Nazarene Fund, and they're trying to see if they can help. And for me, that was like, at that point, I was reaching out to everyone. So to have someone reach out to me was insane. And so, I spoke to him every day. We were able to get my family moved because who runs a Conservative Daily podcast, he was working with me as well to try and get my family out on the flights, the 6 flights that were, that I later found out were, from Mercury One, from the Nazarene Fund. And he had tried and gotten my family's name on one of the manifests. And I was able to help move my wife from Kabul to Maz. And we did it in 2 separate vehicles. The vehicle that my wife was in, it was a little bit of a scare there, because as they were going through areas where there was a lot of fighting going on. They went through right next to the Pine Share Valley, where the Taliban were still fighting the northern resistance, and that was, for me, it was kind of crazy. And for about 4.5 hours, I had no communication with her. I kept calling and no one was answering. And I got a call from another group telling me about a vehicle, that was all women, and they were found and stopped and killed. So at the same time, I'm freaking out, thinking, what if something happened to my wife on the way? And finally, I get a call 4.5 hours later saying, hey, we finally made it. And it was a surprise to me, because they were actually supposed to be there about 3.5 hours earlier than that. They ended up getting stalled on the way, but they finally got there. And the rest of her family had traveling early in the morning after her, trying to separate the vehicles. And they were all in Maz, and we were waiting. And then every day I spoke with Jacob on the phone. At the same time, I spoke with anyone and everyone I could. Spoke with contacts in the Air Force. Basically, anyone that I thought might be able to help, I was speaking to them. And we were just trying to find any and every way to get them out. To the tune of actually putting me in communication with and telling me about a group that was going to be going into Uzbekistan. To go from the U.S., go to Uzbekistan, go over the border, and try and get him out ourselves. And I spoke with him, and that was something that we had planned. And I said, okay, let's do it. And at the same time, I'm still speaking with David every day, and every day we had trouble because the planes weren't able to get off the ground. There's 6 planes, and every day, for one reason or another, can't get them off the ground. We had a few close calls where it's like, okay, yes, I think we're ready to go. And then 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 10 hours pass by, and it's like, oh no, we're not able to get up. And to me, just to have someone, just to know that someone else was staying up day and night to try and make something happen, that to me was everything. And so, for me, it was emotional, it was difficult. And I was on the way from DC coming back to Salt Lake. I had just come back to Salt Lake, and I was prepping and getting everything I needed to go to Uzbekistan. I had my visa in hand, and I was going to go to Uzbekistan with these people I'd never met, just to go over the border and try and get them out ourselves, just do whatever we had to do. And I think it was 2 days before I was leaving when, I finally get a text, then I get a call, and things moved. And, it was almost surreal. I didn't really believe it until they were wheels up and they were in the air. And even then, I was like, okay, no, you know what? I hope that, I hope they don't get, what's the right word? I hope they don't get grounded again. And so finally, wheels are up, and I'm just waiting and waiting and waiting, and they finally get to Doha. And the other groups that I was working with, they reached out to their contacts, and I had people on the ground looking for them in Doha, and they couldn't find them. And that, that freaked me out even more. But I was able to speak to my family finally when they did get internet connection, and they weren't able to locate them in the crowds, but they eventually located them. So I get a photo from a contact saying, "Hey, look who we found," and that changed everything for me.
So if you want to, if we can step back a little bit, and then we can talk about the reunification.
So when my wife was in Afghanistan and I'm in India, we were trying to figure out a plan for her to get out. And so several times, we got letters from CENTCOM, we got letters from the U.S. government, we got a letter of visa approval for interview. And so we had all the documents we needed, and they would tell us specifically to go to this gate or that gate. And one of the most prominent times for us was Abbey Gate, because my wife had been sent there a couple times. The first time they went there, and that night was absolute chaos. I was still in Salt Lake, and my flight was the next day. They're at Abbey Gate, where they had been told to go. The family had waited there overnight. They'd been there for, I want to say, 20 hours almost at that point. And my wife was, 34 weeks, 35 weeks pregnant. They didn't have water. They didn't have anything. They were just sitting on the road and waiting and waiting and waiting. Finally, they got up to the gate. And it was kind of heartbreaking. My wife was on the phone, and I had told them to go get printouts of my passport, of her visa approval letter, of all these other documents, and she had them all in hand. And then they had emailed us a document which would essentially be like your ticket into the airport. It was a document saying that you were supposed to be there. They had gotten these printed, and they took it with them, and they'd spent all that time there. And as they're getting closer and closer to this gate by the Baron Hotel and by Abbey Gate, my little niece was lost in the crowd. The Taliban had separated her from her father, and they were beating both of my brother-in-laws. They had thrown out essentially like a pepper spray bombs everywhere. So my wife, my sister-in-laws, my mother-in-law, their faces looked burned, just like a chemical burn. My brother-in-laws had bruises all over their body. They'd gotten beaten up pretty good, and they can't find their little girl. I remember I didn't sleep at all because I was on the phone the entire time, calling people at CENTCOM, calling people to try and figure out where the girl might be. And I got into contact with someone at CENTCOM who was able to speak to someone from the British forces, because when they saw that the Taliban had ripped the little girl away from the family, another member of the Taliban had grabbed the child and basically pushed her in front of the Baron Hotel. And one of the British soldiers had just pulled her in. And so they couldn't go in there. The Baron Hotel was like a meeting spot for people with British passports, and that they were trying to get out. And they were looking frantically for this girl for almost 7 hours, until finally I get word back that she's there. My wife and my sister-in-law were finally allowed in to just get the daughter and get back out. And that was like the first frightening step for us, was going to the airport that first time, waiting in total over 30 hours, losing their child, their 3-year-old child, not knowing what was going to happen, and then having both of my brother-in-laws get beat in front of their families. To them, it was, that's when they really understood how dangerous everything was. And so they went home, and we tried to regroup and reorganize and get things together. The next time my wife was told to go to Abbey Gate was actually, I think, her 4th attempt to get to the airport. And that time, she was alone. And we were trying to we had a friend that had gotten into the airport and was in the airport waiting, and he was working with some of the soldiers in there, the Marines that were inside. He was translating for them. And they had agreed to help him out, and he was going to meet my wife basically in a giant ditch where there was just sewage. And they were going to pull her up on the other side and get her in. And that was supposed to be, you know, our key to get her out. Was, you know, let's get her there through a path that we were hoping others wouldn't be going through at a time where there shouldn't be anyone there. And, you know, she goes there. She's alone. And she's going and going and going. And she's, you know, crawling through the sewer trying to get out. And they can't find her. My contact's not able to find her. And we were assuming that there would be no one there. Because, you know, who would be crawling through sewage at that time? And there was thousands of people. There was no way for them to find her in that massive crowd. And anytime someone was trying to find anyone or locate someone, you know, if someone was pulled up, if a lady was pulled up and was asked, hey, you know, which one of these people was your husband, she wasn't even able to answer. Everyone would jump up and just say, it's me, just trying to get out, trying to find a way out, trying to have someone pick him up on the other side and get him out of there. And with her condition, being, you know, about 8 months pregnant, I called it off after several hours of her crawling through there trying to get out and them not being able to find her. I told her, no, you need to get out, because not only could you get pushed or fall or get stomped on or get hurt, but, you know, the sanitation, it's filthy. And so I'm afraid of her getting sick. I'm afraid of what might happen. And so we called it off. And her brother had waited that whole time at the same spot where he had basically separated from her and had her go onward. And she was able to finally get back to him after maybe 4 or 5 hours, and they finally went home. And this was all through the night. And those are only, you know, 2 of the instances of her trying to get out. Another instance where, for us, it was really terrible, and my wife pretty much gave up, was when I reached out to CENTCOM, and they had finally told us, hey, you know, your wife is on this short list of people, and we need her at this gate here at this particular time. I think they had told her 4 p.m. in front of the Marines had basically established the, I'm trying to remember the name of it. The Marines had established it was a building for the Ministry of Interior, and they were controlling the gates from the inside, but not the outside. And they sent us a letter, and they told her to be there at 4 p.m. So my father-in-law and my brother-in-law take her there. And, you know, they've got their letter and everything. They're waiting in the car, and we had a glimmer of hope. There's next to nobody there. There was maybe 10 or 11 cars of a few people. And we thought, okay, this might be it. You know, they told us it's a few people, this should work. 4 p.m. comes by, and they're waiting there, and they're saying, hey, well, can we go in? And the Taliban are the ones outside of the gate, controlling who's allowed in or not. And that part really is what worried me, because they're telling us, hey, it's a short list of people. My wife's name is on the list. That list has their phone number, their address, it has everything for where they were staying at the time in their safe house. And, you know, she's there waiting. 4 p.m. rolls by, and they say, no, we're not letting anyone in yet. And I guess when others started to notice, like, hey, look, there's not a lot of people here, people started calling or trying to get, you know, other people from their families there to try and get as many as they could out. Well, by around 8 or 9 o'clock, there was thousands on the street waiting. Instead of 10 or 11 cars, you couldn't take a step. It was completely full. And, you know, my brother-in-law was still waiting with her, right up at the front, right in front of the gate. And there's just thousands waiting around them. And the Taliban won't let anyone through. And they're just picking people out of the crowd to bring up to the gate to check, and just sending them back, not letting anyone through anyway. And my brother-in-law, he's getting frustrated, and my wife is getting really tired. They don't have food. They don't have water. They've been waiting there this whole day. They're waiting out in the sun. It was, as you can imagine, it's August in Afghanistan. It's hot. It's a desert, and they're all dehydrated. And so when one of the Taliban turns to look the other direction, he tells her to book it and run and go right up to the gate. And so she does. So she runs up to the gate where there's a gentleman with a clipboard and names and everything, and the guy who's watching my brother-in-law turns around and hits him once, and then starts talking to him and saying he's a coward for letting, he doesn't know if it's his sister or who else, but he's just saying, how could you let our women out? Why are you letting someone go through? And he responds back telling them, well, you're the coward for letting a pregnant woman stand here all day. And my wife is standing there talking to another member of the Taliban at the gate and showing him the document, saying, look, I was told to be here at 4 p.m. And the guy's like, no. Just telling her no. Saying, no, you don't have a U.S. passport. You can't go through. And she's just begging the guy, saying, look, my husband's a U.S. citizen. This is my document. And eventually the guy ends up just slapping her and takes his rifle and points it at her stomach and says, you can either go now or you don't go at all. And she ends up, having tears in her eyes. She's trying to keep herself as composed as she could, and she runs back to her brother. And at that point, I'm on the phone with my father-in-law who's watching this, and I can't imagine what he's thinking. But all I know is from my side, I said, no, it's not worth it. If that's how this gate is, that's not going to work. We need another plan. And I had them take her home. And we were lucky because others, while she was just slapped, the things she went through and the toughness that she showed, to me, was incredible. There's other women that had miscarriages. There's other women that were attacked. There's other women who died right along everyone else. And so for her to be able to go through all that and come out of it okay on the other side, it was everything to us. Especially when the day after, and this is actually the day after my wife had gone through the sewage, and that was by Abbey Gate. The day after is when the explosion went off. And, I was really thankful that she wasn't there waiting still. And then I saw images of people in the sewage that had died right in front of Abbey Gate. And the only thing that kept going through my mind was my wife could have been in the middle of that crowd. She was there the night before. And I was thankful that I told her to call it quits and leave when she did. So family's back at the safe house in this apartment that I had set him up with, and I had reached out to another NGO. The contact I had at CENTCOM, this colonel, she put me into contact with an NGO who was helping these female doctors. And they were setting up a bus that was going to be taking these female doctors into the airport. Because at that point, the only way to get into the airport was on those buses. You couldn't go through the gates at all. And she called me, she spoke to me, and I confirmed everything with her, and she told me, yeah, just be ready. We'll be giving you a call. And I get a call from her in the morning saying, okay, have them go to this place, have them be ready. There's going to be a bus. They're just going to get on it. We're going to be taking them into the airport. And about 30 minutes later, I get another call saying, hey, I'm sorry to tell you this, but there's been another explosion. Abbey Gate's gone. And they had sealed everything off at that point. And the bus was not going to go through. Everything was done. And this was, I think, on the very end of August, because that was the day they stopped all extraction at the airport in Kabul. And they cut it short by a few days. And that little glimmer of hope that we had of, hey, we still have another day, we have another day, we have 2 days left, we have 3 days left, that just went away all of a sudden when we were being told, hey, all the gates are being welded shut. we're not going to be able to go through. And that to me was just sort of like a gut punch where we just couldn't think of how we were going to go forward.
You ultimately did.
Ultimately, we did, and that was a very happy moment when they were up in the air. But
So walk us through that moment again, because we kind of cut you off last time.
No worries. Well, once I finally got the call, letting them know in Maz that, hey, the plane's taken off. Let's get them ready. You know, I felt like I was still dreaming. I felt like I had fallen asleep, because at that point, I was sleeping every 2 or 3 days, and I was only sleeping for maybe a half an hour, or 20 minutes, or sometimes even 15 minutes, and that was it. So, you know, I thought maybe I'd gone into a hallucination or something, and I'm just imagining it. And they get on a plane. They're in the air, and the only thing going through my mind was, you know, with the way everything had gone, it's kind of like the devil speaking in the back of your head, just saying, oh no, that plane's going to get grounded again. And when they finally made it to Qatar, and that was everything. And then when I finally received a picture of someone who ended up being a good friend to us later, being with her family, standing with them and sending me the photo, that to me kind of solidified and said, okay, no, this is real. They're there. And that was a moment where I sort of just had to repack again. I was just packing, getting ready to go to Uzbekistan to try and get him out. And now I was repacking all my bags and my luggage, and I was getting ready to go to Doha. And I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to make some really good friends along the way. And I was able to get to Doha, meet with some friends, and finally be with my wife and be there for the birth of my son. And it was everything to us. And again, I kind of went with the same philosophy of just helping anyone I could. And while I was there, every day while we were waiting to get all their stuff processed, I was volunteering my time with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Interior and the villas, and I was helping all the other families who had gone out there and who were pregnant or who just had their child, because they didn't really have systems in place where, you know, a child might have been born in Qatar, but now they don't have any documentation or a birth certificate. So I had to kind of figure that out for them and help them and get them what they needed to try and go forward. And you know, it all paid off in the end. But for me, the part that really kind of it showed me the good in the world, where groups that have nothing to do with you, at the end of the day, will say, "Hey, we're going to help this person," and they took the place of what we thought would have been the government, of the people that we thought would help us, and they stepped up and they were able to take matters into their own hands and help us do what we thought would be impossible at that time. And it saved our family, it saved everything.
Including the Nazarene Fund.
Yeah, and well, that's what I mean. The Nazarene Fund, the fact that they were able to step in and do what they did, the fact that we were able to get those flights up in the air and get these people out that had nothing to do with them, it showed me that, yeah, there is good in the world and that there is someone who cares when things seemed really dark.
When you look your wife and your son in the eyes now, and you think about all this, I mean...
It almost seems like it was like a terrible dream, but then reality sort of hits me hard, and I know it's not, because you know, there's still people there. I have family there. My wife has family there. I have aunts, uncles, cousins who are dealing with this every day, and what, you know, seemed to me like a terrible nightmare at that moment is currently their life. And that's what really kind of makes it difficult. It's just every time I kind of look at that, I thank God, and I thank everyone who's helped me, and you know, it never would have happened without the Nazarene Fund doing what they did and getting them out. And all I can imagine is who's going to be there for the next family that needs help.
In a way, it's almost like you're breaking a generational cycle of the Taliban, right? Being able to cause trauma for the family, right?
Yeah. I hope that we can break away from that and really see some change. And I hope to never have myself or anyone in my family go through that. But I know there's others who are still going through that every day. I know hundreds of people right now whose families are left behind, whose children are there, whose wives are there, whose husbands are there, and haven't found a way to get out, haven't found help, haven't found assistance. I understand where they're coming from, and I can see how to them it feels like they have no option. It feels like their hands are tied behind their back. And I feel for them.
We've been asking this in all the interviews today, but these videos are specifically going to be used for storytelling and to strike a chord with the person who's viewing it. So if you had 5 seconds, 10 seconds to grab someone's attention and say, hey, like kind of shake them from their bubble, like this is real, what would that message be?
What would you do if your wife was 8 months pregnant and had a gun pointed at her stomach and you couldn't think of any way to help her at that moment? That's what's happening to people. It's still happening. What would you do if your daughter was killed for trying to go to school? What would you do if you were killed just because you had a business that your government didn't like? And they killed you and left your wife and your children with nothing to survive.
These are all people that you know. Those are all cases.
That's everyone there. I've had family who've been kidnapped already. I've had family who've been killed. My father was killed. My mother and myself, we were left with nothing when my father was killed. My wife was pregnant and had a gun pointed at her stomach. What would you do in that situation? What could you do? And if that can't pull someone's attention in, if our mortality can't pull someone's attention, and the reality that there's still inhumane actions happening there, I don't know what else could get someone's attention.
On to a lighter note, what are your hopes for your family now resettled here and officially in the U.S.? I imagine you're probably not heading back to Afghanistan anytime soon.
No, I don't have any plans to go anytime soon. And I honestly, right now with our family, my in-laws, they've had their children here, so we've got a few young U.S. citizens in the family now, and it's just one of the greatest feelings to be able to have your family around you. And it's sort of changed everything, and our plans now are to grow and prosper and to live a fruitful life, and when possible, give back to others and help others who are in that situation.